While I was unemployed, I found that volunteering gave me a great deal of satisfaction, and it certainly kept me busy. My friend Karen Locke was involved with a group called the Rainbow Guild, which raised funds for the Amy Karen Cancer Fund for Children. They were having their 20th anniversary charity gala at the Beverly Hilton, and Karen asked me if I'd like to help out. Of course, I said yes. I ended up producing the order of the show, which was called The Best of Broadway, and writing speeches for the participants. I Dream a Genie star Barbara Eden hosted the show, and awards were handed out, including the Jill Ireland Award, named after the actress who died the previous year from cancer. Tom Bosley from Happy Days gave this particular award to actress Tracy Nelson, daughter of singer Ricky Nelson, for her courageous battle against cancer. The following year, in 1992, I again produced the programme for another Rainbow Guild charity event entitled An Evening of Magic. This time the person accepting the Jill Ireland Award was actor Jack Klugman, probably best known for appearing in the TV version of The Odd Couple with Tony Randall. Jack had been suffering with throat cancer for several years, but he continued to work despite the fact that he'd lost a vocal cord and his voice was raspy. Both Tracy Nelson and Jack Klugman are fine examples of never giving in to this insidious disease. Tracy was first diagnosed at the age of 24 and has bravely survived 3 different forms of cancer. Jack lived with cancer for close to 40 years and died at the ripe old age of 90. It just shows you what the human body can endure with the help of a strong spirit. During this time, a friend of mine, actor Bob Dickman, asked if I'd like to produce a short film he'd written, in which he'd star. It was quirky and took place in a cemetery and a morgue. I got my friends involved, and even though the subject was somewhat morbid, we all had fun. The film went on to win the Best of the Fest award at the Seattle Film Festival. Anyway, life was never dull, and I was constantly being challenged with new experiences. You may remember, though, that I was an illegal alien in the US and didn't have the necessary green card or work visa. Fortunately, luck was on my side because I'd been given a good Social Security number when I arrived in California in 1980, which meant I could work and pay taxes, even though it was against the law. Now, if the immigration department found out that I was an undocumented worker, my employers, including Barry, of course, as well as Disney, MGM, and Paramount Pictures, would have faced strict penalties for hiring me. I would also have been deported. Then in 1986, Ronald Reagan passed the amnesty bill, and immigrants who'd entered the country before 1982 were able to apply to become legal. I qualified, but there was a slight problem when I told my immigration lawyer that I would be going to Thailand for at least 6 months to work on Good Morning Vietnam. This was against the rules of the amnesty bill. I couldn't leave the States for longer than 30 days. Nevertheless, I filled out the mountain of necessary paperwork, including proof of residency, and submitted everything to the immigration department before I left for Thailand in February 1987. I was told that it would take at least 6 months before I was called for an interview, and I prayed that it wasn't any earlier, since I was probably going to be in Thailand. By March of 1988, over a year after I'd applied for my green card, I hadn't heard from immigration. I figured there was probably quite a backlog since thousands, if not millions, of immigrants had applied for amnesty. So I continued to go about my business, working on Rain Man and then Avalon. But now it was the end of 1989, and I still hadn't heard anything. I actually can't remember being that worried about it. But when I eventually got in touch with the appropriate department, I was told that they didn't have any record that my document had ever been submitted. I was in shock. What? You've got to be kidding me. Thankfully, I had copies of everything I'd originally submitted, so I sent them off again. I think there was another fee to pay too, which was a pain. A few weeks later, I received more forms to complete, including one related to travels out of the country. I was required to show my passport and the rest of the completed forms at my appointment a month or so later. My British passport had expired, and I'd been using my Canadian passport for travelling in and out of the States because it was easier to travel as a Canadian citizen rather than a British one. I knew if I showed my passport, though, I was going to be in trouble for travelling back and forth to Thailand for months at a time. An English friend of mine, Stephanie, was also illegal, as was her Mexican husband, and she suggested I go to see their Mexican immigration lawyer in downtown LA, who, she said, might be able to advise me. You have to get there early, though. She said he gets pretty busy. I got to the lawyer's office in the Latino area of LA around 7:30 a.m., thinking I'd be the first. But there was a line around the building, and at least 20 mostly Hispanic people were in front of me. I was the only Caucasian. The lawyer opened his office at 9 a.m., and I finally got to see him around 1 o'clock. He was a man in his 40s with a very easygoing manner, and his cluttered office reflected this attitude. I explained my situation to him, travelling to Thailand when I shouldn't have, etc., and the fact that I would have to produce my passport showing entry and exit stamps, which would definitely get me into trouble. Well, what passport was that? He asked. My Canadian passport. Is that the one you lost? He said. I looked at him quizzically. Didn't you lose that passport? Then he opened his door and said, don't worry about it, and have a nice day. That was the extent of the meeting, which incidentally didn't cost me anything, apart from being subtly advised to lie about losing my passport. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it short. When I arrived for my immigration appointment at a building near the airport, the large room was crowded with people of various nationalities, mostly Latin American. I'd arrived wearing my best suit and carrying a briefcase containing my papers, minus passport, of course. I was the only Caucasian in the room, and it was assumed that I was a lawyer representing an illegal client. A large, imposing woman approached me and led me to her office. It turns out that she was the supervisor, and I think she was relieved that I spoke English. She was also impressed that I'd organised my paperwork so well. That's the Virgo in me. As she went through each section methodically, dealing with banking, utility payments, employment records, salary checks, etc., her phone rang frequently with questions from her immigration colleagues who, she said, were dealing with over 400 applicants just that day. She left the office each time and apologized profusely for doing this. It was probably after the third call that she came back and turned to the page dealing with my passport. I was pretty much shaking my shoes, knowing that I was going to have to lie about losing my passport, when the phone rang again. The supervisor was clearly annoyed as she listened, and then got up again. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I've got to go again and deal with this. I'm really sorry." I looked at my file on her desk and the open page headed passport, and my stomach was in knots. How was I going to explain that I'd lost it when I hadn't? She was bound to know that I was lying. 5 minutes later, the supervisor came back into the office and sat down in front of the glaring passport page. Now, where were we? Then, through the grace of God and my guardian angel, she turned the page as if she'd already dealt with the passport section. I couldn't believe it. But I always had the attitude that if I was meant to be in America, everything would work out. If not, I could always return to Canada or to England. Fortunately, I wasn't fleeing my home for reasons of political persecution or poverty. So I really was one of the lucky ones. Next time, back with Barry Levinson, working on a new script to star Joe Pesci. If you're enjoying my episodes, my social media guru, Horatio, has asked that you please like the recordings, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified when I post my next episode on Sunday. Many thanks, and your support is greatly appreciated.